I have the honor to welcome you today to a new episode of the WIMES podcast, today on December 12, 2025. WIMES is a non-governmental, non-profit organization established in Vienna in March 2022. The institute is guided by an advisory board composed of distinguished practitioners, scholars, diplomats, and experts from the Middle East and beyond. WIMES aims at advancing inclusive international dialogue and understanding among and of the Middle Eastern nations. Our vision is to identify the root causes of conflict and to promote innovative and sustainable solutions for peace in the region. Today, we are joined by Dr. Trita Parsi, one of the world's leading experts of the US strategy in the Middle East and Middle Eastern diplomacy. The subject of our discussion today will be US strategy in the Middle East, past, present, and future. Dr. Parsi holds a PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. He also holds a master's degrees in international relations from Uppsala University and in economics from the Stockholm School of Economics. Dr. Parsi is the executive vice president and co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank dedicated to advancing diplomacy over war. He is also an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Since 2021, the Washingtonian magazine has named him among the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C., and Noam Chomsky has described him as one of the most distinguished scholars on Iran. He has authored 4 major books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Iran and Israel, including Treacherous Alliance, Israel and the U.S., A Single Roll of the Dice, and Losing an Enemy. Earlier in his career, he worked for the Swedish Permanent Mission to the UN, where he served in the UN Security Council and the General Assembly's Third Committee. He has taught international relations at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Georgetown, NYU, George Washington University, and has been affiliated with the Middle East Institute and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. His analysis regularly appears in major international outlets globally. We are truly honored to have Dr. Parsi with us today for this timely discussion. His achievements speak for themselves, so let's continue with our questions and dive into the main topic of today, the US strategy in the Middle East, past, present, and future. To start, for decades, the US strategy in the Middle East was built around oil, support for Israel, and the containment of several states and non-state actors through interventions, sanctions, and regime changes. Looking back today, what do you think were the biggest strategic miscalculations or turning points to set the course for where the region and US influence stand today?
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I think the biggest mistake was actually the strategy itself. The United States chose to go down the path of establishing its military hegemony in the region with a faulty understanding and definition of what its own interest was. If you take a look at how the US throughout that period had defined its interest, it was essentially everything. If you go and look at a think tank report, for instance, if they even bothered to define what US interests would be 7, 8, 9 points, and then at the end it would be a catch-all variable that would say that our interest is to stand by our allies. Well, then essentially it means that all of the interests of those allies are also now suddenly American interests. And then you end up in a situation in which everything is a US interest. And this is part of the reason why we ended up with an approach to the Middle East in which the US completely overextended itself in the region and also did so unsuccessfully. If you take a look at the number of conflicts in the region in 1998, for instance, there were 5 military conflicts ongoing in 1998. By 2020, there were 22. So you had a dramatic increase of warfare and violence during the period of American hegemony. It doesn't mean that everything is America's fault, of course, but a lot of those conflicts were derivatives of the US's invasion of Iraq that destabilized the region profoundly. And that absolutely is the US's fault. So I think the entire approach has been highly, highly unsuccessful. And as long as that broader strategy was problematic, it would be very difficult to find successes within that were sustainable. I think the JCPOA was a success, but ended up not being sustainable. And I had my suspicions long before Trump came in that there was a risk of it collapsing precisely because it was an aberration within that strategy. The United States could continue to be involved in Afghanistan for 20 years, but because that was in line with the grand strategy. But making a deal with a country like Iran based on a real compromise, that was an aberration and not something that was actually sustained or supported by the grand strategy. Now we have an interesting situation because if you read the Trump NSS, it is a blatant rejection of a lot of these different things. It is a rejection of the idea that the United States has to have a hegemony in the Middle East and in many other areas. It does still say that the United States needs to prevent the hegemony of others in these regions, but it doesn't have to establish its own. And that's a very significant difference from where we have been. Also, a significant cost difference for the United States to just prevent anyone else establishing hegemony compared to it itself establishing and sustaining that hegemony. Now, whether that approach, actually, that principle that has been established in the NSS, actually is appropriately translated into policy remains to be seen. Because when you read the Middle East section, there's some good things in it, but there's also a lot of repeating of previous approaches. I mean, there's language from the last 30 years, such as defining Iran as the chief destabilizing actor in the region, a perception or a perspective that increasingly is not shared by regional states who increasingly see Israel as the main problem rather than Iran. So there's a lot of language in there that still seems to be following the inertia of the past. And as a result, it's difficult to really be certain of what direction the policy will take us. Some of the principles are sound, but their interaction with reality has not yet fully been tested.
Thank you so much. Now, in terms of more current events, how would you assess Trump's Gaza plan within this broader US strategy in the Middle East?
I think I mean, first of all, I think there's a reason why, an important reason why so many countries came out in support of the initial 20-point plan. And that was because for the first time, Trump was really willing to put pressure on Israel. We had seen him put pressure on Israel in the beginning of his term when he first got a ceasefire, but rather quickly he let up on that pressure, and the Israelis very effectively managed to make sure that that plan never even got to phase two. Now you had a situation in which after the Israeli attack on Doha, there was a completely new attitude in the region in the sense that the war or the slaughter in Gaza was now leading to a scenario in which other countries, not the usual ones that Israel would bomb, but other countries such as Doha would be attacked. And if you're sitting in Muscat, for instance, I'm sure they were very concerned because the pretext that the Israelis used was to say that they were targeting Hamas, who was there for negotiations. Well, that then opens up the door that Israel would also bomb Muscat because Muscat is hosting mediation talks with the Houthis. So this opened a completely different door, and the region very quickly came together and put collective pressure on Trump, and he responded positively. So all of these countries came along and supported this, not because of the substance of the plan. Many of the people, some of them even involved in drafting the plan, have told me that the plan was terrible, but it was what was needed in order to get the United States to shift the trajectory that had existed up until that point, which was a trajectory in which the US gave Israel a complete carte blanche and took away almost all of the constraints that previously had been imposed on Israel by the United States. Not massive amount of constraints, but nevertheless constraints that forced Israel to conduct itself rather differently. So that is one aspect that I think is important to understand. That does not mean that the plan itself is good, that these countries believed in it, but they was the best shot at the time to be able to change the trajectory. Now, when we take a look at the plan, I think there was ways in which some aspects of it could have been salvaged. But once it was manifested in the UN Security Council resolution, and that was voted approvingly by the Council, I think now we're really set on a very negative trajectory when it comes to the Gaza plan. Everything from separating Gaza into two different entities, um, cementing an Israeli occupation of half of Gaza, but also actually the US completely senselessly, allowing itself to now become the custodian of that occupation. We just heard yesterday that Trump is going to announce that a two-star American general is going to be overseeing all of this operation. So instead of the United States extracting itself from the Middle East, in line with what the current NSS is saying, and making sure that the US's military involvement, military presence becomes less than it was before. We're actually seeing the Trump administration going in the complete opposite direction. And this is starting to increasingly smack of resemblances with the US's disastrous occupation of Iraq. So I think this is a very negative development. I think one of the characteristics that we see in the Trump administration is that some good principles and ideas can come from the top, but then once it comes to the implementation stage, if Trump is not on it fully, and sustains pressure on Israel, for instance, and also make sure that some of the people in the implementation team of Trump actually sticks to the original principles, then we see these things devolve into what we're now seeing in Gaza, which is increasingly looking like past US policy rather than a shift away from past policies of the United States.
Thank you so much for this assessment. And this brings me directly to my next question. Namely, how would you assess the influence of the Israel lobby in Washington on US foreign policy, specifically in the current Trump administration?
So the influence of the pro-Israel lobby in the United States over the course of the past decades have been very, very significant. Certain issues have essentially been under tremendous influence of the pro-Israel lobby. US-Iran relations, to a large extent, have been a function of Israeli-Iranian tensions and the role of the pro-Israel lobby in Israel. And that strength has been suffocating at times, and has really set the trajectory for US policy on a lot of different areas. For the first time, we're actually seeing some profound shifts in terms of the strength of that lobby, which is declining. And we're seeing the changes in the attitudes of the American public on a bipartisan way, which we had not seen before. So already since 2017, we started to see the beginning of a trend in which younger Republicans started to adopt different attitude towards Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Already 5, 6 years prior to that, we had seen that taking place on the Democratic side. And particularly the convergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Palestinian cause ended up really changing matters on the Democratic side on Israel. 10, 15 years ago, there was a concept that said progressive on everything but Israel, meaning that there was a lot of progressives in the Democratic Party, but they still held a very pro-Israel position. That concept doesn't even exist any longer, because if you're a progressive today in the United States, the likelihood that you have a much more balanced position on Israel-Palestine is overwhelming. But 10, 15 years ago, that was still a phenomenon. But it's not until recently that we're starting to see it shifting on the Republican side, but it is shifting very, very fast. Younger Republicans, particularly male Republicans, who define themselves as being America first, supporters of Trump, are shifting away from Israel in a dramatic way, in a speedy way, but also in some ways in a very deep way. It's not out of a compassion for the Palestinians or an empathy with the Palestinians, which is more what you saw on the Democratic side. It is in some ways more of an empathy with themselves, a compassion with themselves, because what you have in the United States is that when you take a look at where do American military personnel come from, they're overwhelmingly recruited from red districts, from Republican districts. Those are the districts in which you see American soldiers coming home in coffins, coming home without arms and legs, coming home with PTSD, coming home and then committing suicide. They're the ones that are bearing the brunt of America's many, many endless and senseless wars. So the anti-war sentiments on the American right are very, very strong, in some aspects perhaps stronger, but they're also there because of the direct cost that they are paying. Not to say that it's not happening on the left as well, but it is happening to a greater extent on the right. This then gave birth to a lot of different new thinking on the American right, including and anger towards countries, allies of the United States, that they believe, rightly or wrongly, have been responsible for dragging the US into those wars. And for quite some time, they held that view while still making an exception for Israel. But that exception essentially ended 2 or 3 years ago, in which it simply was not, the cognitive dissonance was just too strong to be able to, on the one hand, hold that view about the role of some US allies and then make an exception for Israel. Because if you make an exception for Israel, you have negated the entire principle. And both the war in Ukraine and the slaughter in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, obviously catapulted this forward even further. And then, of course, it was the war with Iran, in which a lot of people in that camp were very, very angry. Not just that there was this war, but they saw so clearly that from the first second that Trump came in, Netanyahu and Israel was pushing the United States to go to war, which is exactly the sentiment that they had turned away from and were so angry about. They were taking a look at videos of Netanyahu in 2002, in which he was making statements in the US Congress in favor of the war with Iraq and promising the American public what an amazing thing it would be if the US invaded Iraq. And the anger of the Iraq war is still very, very strong. So all of this has added to a dramatic shift amongst younger Republicans. It is not the same thing when you take a look at Republicans at 60 plus or 55 plus. But when you're taking a look at Republicans under 40, it's definitely the case, particularly at under 25. And that is going to have profound impacts in the next elections. And probably by 5 or so years from now, we're going to see the full result of it. But already in the upcoming election in November of next year, I wouldn't be surprised if this issue ends up becoming a litmus test for many Republicans in some key races. It already has been on the Democratic side. We may also see it on the Republican side.
Thank you so much. Now, what is your assessment of Trump's performance based on his advocacy and rhetoric of peace in the Middle East, bearing in mind the military attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities this June?
So Trump does talk about peace, and in some ways, I think one has to be appreciative of that, because we didn't see the Biden administration even use that word in a profound way. In fact, anyone who was pushing for diplomacy on Ukraine, for instance, and finding a way to peace was attacked and vilified in Washington during those eras. So some of the things Trump says about the pursuit of peace, we haven't seen a lot of American presidents talk about for 20 or so years. And I think that's in and of itself is important. But it's even more important to make sure that it is appropriately implemented. And there, I think we have to be frank and say that this has been somewhat disappointing. There should not have been an attack against Iran in the first place. This not only was an illegal attack, but ultimately put Trump in a worse situation, in the sense that the prospects of actually getting a nuclear deal is much, much more difficult now as a result of that attack. And given the fact that Trump appears to be deeply desiring some sort of a deal, deeply desiring an ability to say that he resolved the conflict with Iran, then he has undermined his own ambitions with this attack. Now, Trump does seem to believe that he did this to stop the ongoing war between Israel and Iran. And that may be the case in his mind. But that war would not have started in the first place had Trump put down his foot and said no to the Israelis. If he from the outset had stuck to his original red line, which was that there should not be a nuclear weapon in Iran, instead of shifting it halfway through the negotiations to adopt the Israeli red line, which is that there shouldn't be any nuclear program at all, zero enrichment, dismantlement, then he would have had a nuclear deal by now. And it would have been a stronger nuclear deal from the US perspective than what the US had with the JCPOA. But he caved to the Israelis. And as a result, he caved to the Israelis both on the negotiations and then later on this attack. We wouldn't have been here at all had he stood firm on those principles from the outset.
Thank you so much for this. And now this brings me to a more future-oriented question in this regard. Would you predict Israel to attack Iran again in the future? And would the US be dragged into this again?
I think there is a significant risk that Israel will attack again. I originally believed that this would happen sometime before the end of December. I would extend that timeline a little bit, but I still believe that the risk of the Israelis attacking is very, very significant. And the reason for that is because ultimately Israel's attack was a failure. Yes, it did manage to get the United States involved in the war. This is something the Israelis had pushed for more than 20 years. But they wanted the United States to be much more involved, not just take out Iran's nuclear facilities. But the two other objectives were failures. They did not manage to bring down the regime, despite the fact that they had successes in killing a large number of scientists and military leaders, top military leaders. And they truly shocked the Iranians. But it didn't bring down the regime. The resilience of the regime turned out to be stronger than the Israelis and the Americans expected. And frankly, I believe it may have proved to be stronger than what even the regime itself believed. And thirdly, the most important thing is that ultimately, this is not about the nuclear program. This is about the balance of power in the region. This is about Israel's maneuverability and its ability to make sure that there is no country in the region or no combination of countries in the region that can pose a threat, not to Israel's security, but to Israel's domination. And Iran can do that. What the Israelis wanted to achieve, I'm not saying they thought they could achieve it in one go, but they wanted to achieve a scenario in which Iran would have been turned into the next Lebanon or the next Syria. Countries that Israel can attack at will, with impunity, and without American involvement. That's what they do on a daily basis in Syria and in Lebanon. Of course, they've been doing that in the West Bank and in Gaza for a very long time. They wanted to turn Iran into that as well, and it ultimately failed. Because if everything stops at this point and there is no renewed fighting, what has then been achieved by Netanyahu in initiating this war is to actually ensure that there is a balance of deterrence, a balance of terror between Iran and Israel, which is exactly the opposite of what the Israelis wanted. There's a reason why the Israelis had to be pushed, and they didn't even agree to a ceasefire with Gaza, with Hamas, for 2 years. And when they did agree on to it, they immediately violated it and made sure that it collapsed in short order. There's a reason why they refused a ceasefire with Hezbollah, and even when they did agree to it, they just keep on bombing. But with Iran, they wanted a ceasefire after 9 days of the war. After 12 days, they got it, and they have not violated it. The reason is simple. Iran's effectiveness with its missiles created a deterrence, a balance of deterrence with the Israelis. And this is exactly the opposite of what the Israelis want. They want to make sure that Iran is under Israel's domination, that Israel cannot deter Israel. Iran cannot deter Israel. And if the war stops at this point, that is now the new normal. So I think from Netanyahu's own perspective, beyond the fact that he needs war in order to stay out of jail, and that this, according to many Israelis I've spoken to, is a key reason they believe that he will start the war again. But just from a strategic standpoint, if we set aside Netanyahu's personal political motivations, having started the war, stopping at this point allows for this balance of deterrence to be established, which is to the detriment of his strategic calculations. And it will become more and more difficult, most likely, if time passes, because the Iranians will be able to rebuild their air defense systems, perhaps buy better ones, perhaps uproot the Mossad presence in the country, which was very extensive and to the surprise of many. They are building missiles faster than the US and Israel can build missile interceptors. The question, of course, ultimately, from a military standpoint, is who is learning the fastest from this 12-day war? Are the Israelis learning faster than the Iranians in terms of how will they close the gaps in their air defense systems? Are the Iranians learning faster than the Israelis in terms of figuring out even more effective ways of circumventing Israel's air defense systems? So all of these factors coming together, the balance of it, in my view, is that there's a high likelihood that the Israelis will attack. The reason I thought that end of December would likely be around the time that this window closed is because of the political landscape in the United States. Because it goes to the second part of your question, will the US be part of it or not? Once the US is deep into its midterm elections, it will become more complicated for the Israelis to do this. It's already been costly for Trump with many of the things Israel has done. And the question is, will he be able to accept that the Israelis will do something like this, despite the fact that it will cost him politically, or will he put down his foot and prevent them from doing so? We have seen that when Trump wants to say no to Israel, he can. Unlike Biden, who never wanted to and then claimed that he couldn't. He could, he didn't want to. But Trump can do so and has done so. And the question is whether he will do so again if the Israelis come to the US with this proposition. It's important to understand that ultimately the Israelis cannot defend their air defenses without the support of the United States, both physical support with the THAAD batteries, but also the intelligence support. And as a result, from a military standpoint, it would be quite insane, frankly, for the Israelis to start this war without coordination with the US. Unfortunately, there are Israelis who are telling me that they do believe that Netanyahu is so adamant about this issue and he is so willing to sacrifice Israeli lives that he may actually do so even without the US's coordination from the outset, but then with the hope that once the war has started, he will be able to push the US to support it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parsi, for this realistic outlook on the future. This concludes our questions for today. If there are any more assessments or remarks you would like to make on the current Trump administration's strategy in the Middle East, you're very welcome to do so.
Thank you so much. No, this was very good. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of our institute, we extend our deepest gratitude for your time and for sharing your invaluable expertise on such a pressing and sensitive issue. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much.
And we hope for
Appreciate it.
continued collaboration in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Likewise.